Today I'm going to show you how to make a solid wood desktop. I made mine custom out of ash wood over 7 feet long. But wait a second. Let's go back to the beginning and see how I got here. After cleaning out my office, I could finally get my newly built base cabinets into position. I adjusted the leveling feet until the cabinets were flush, and I could then clamp them together and attach them with some screws. After checking for level, I positioned and leveled the third cabinet, then popped in all the drawers. If you're interested in seeing how I built these cabinets, I'll leave a link to both the video and the build plans down in the description below. Alright, with the cabinets finally installed and leveled exactly where I want them to be, it's time to get started on the desktop. Now for this, I'm going to be building a solid ash wood desktop that's going to be over 7 feet long. I won't lie, this is the biggest build I've ever taken on before, and it's making me a little bit nervous to tell you the truth. But I've been planning this desk build for months now, and time for procrastination is over. It's time for me to just dive in. I mean, how bad can this turn out, right? Come on, seriously. Let's get started. Wish me luck. The biggest challenge in making this desk will be the limited space I have in my shop. There's not much room to work on such a large project, but that's why most of my tools are on wheels, so I can move things out of the way and make room to use my tools. I'll position my joiner so I'll have at least 8 feet of infeed and 8 feet of outfeed. I'm starting with 5/4 rough sawn ash that I'll mill on all 4 sides. This is my first time milling such long boards, and I quickly realized that my joiner wasn't long enough to support them and be able to work safely. I put everything on hold and made a trip to Princess Auto to pick up a pair of roller stands in order to support the wood both on the infeed and on the outfeed. I started by flattening one face on the joiner, putting the cupped face down, and keeping the pressure on the outfeed side. It took several passes until the face was flat, and let me tell you, working with long solid wood boards is quite the workout. With one face flat, I could flip that face up against my joiner's fence in order to flatten and square one edge. I checked the edge for square, then could move over to the planer to flatten the opposite face. I fed each board one after the other, progressively lowering the cutter head until all the boards were flat and had the same thickness. I was hoping to end up with 1 inch in thickness, but ultimately ended up just a hair below the 1 inch mark. With all the boards milled to their final thickness, the last step is to rip them to their final width at the table saw, running the jointed edge up against the fence. I won't lie, getting big boards perfectly square left me a little frustrated when I realized that there were gaps in my joints. But after flipping a few boards around, I managed to close most of the gaps and get a decent fit. Alright, it's time to get these boards glued up, but after feeling how heavy each of these boards was, I came to the realization that once this desktop was assembled, it would be really long and really heavy. So instead of figuring out a way to carry it up 2 flights once it was all done, I decided to assemble it directly in the office where it would stay. Glue-ups can definitely stress me out, so to make it as stress-free as possible, I got everything ready and carried it all upstairs, starting with my clamps. A lot of clamps. And this is when I'm grateful to have these Bessie K-Body parallel clamps. They make a huge difference in keeping panels flat and getting tight seams without any gaps. And speaking of clamps, a big thanks to Bessie Tools for sponsoring this video. I'll leave links in the description below to all of the clamps that I use, so be sure to check those out. Alright, so here's my glue up process in a nutshell. I applied a thick bead of glue to one edge on 4 out of my 5 boards, getting full coverage on the edge using a glue brush. I can now lay my boards flat and start closing the clamps without tightening just yet, just a light twist until they start to bite. I then add these mini F-clamps to both ends using 1 per seam to make sure it stays aligned and flat. I can then go back and start tightening all the clamps, checking that each board stays flat and the seams look good. For extra insurance, I use clamping cauls in the middle to make sure the panels stay dead flat. These cauls are slightly tapered from the midpoint towards the ends, and I've put clear packing tape on the bottom edge so it won't stick to the glue. Okay, I can now do a final tightening of all my clamps, but oops, almost forgot to add these clamps on this section that overhangs my bench, so I'll add them on top. Alright, time to let this dry, but I won't go too far just yet. After about 30 minutes, I came back to scrape off the glue while it's still soft. I finally found the perfect tool for this at Princess Auto. It's a razor blade scraper, but with plastic blades that won't damage the wood. In the past, I've tried wiping off the glue with a wet rag, and I've tried waiting until it dried and use a chisel, but I got really frustrated with both of those methods. Okay kids, for this next part, don't try this at home. Scraping the glue off the top was one thing, but getting to the other side was quite the workout. This top with all of these clamps is super heavy. And now I know you're wondering, will those flimsy plastic sawhorses hold up under the weight? I wondered the same thing myself, but then again, these sawhorses are rated for 1,200 pounds, so I went for it. And luckily for me, no catastrophes ensued. The glue was starting to harden by now, so I quickly finished up. Once all the glue was scraped away, I let the top cure in the clamps for a full 24 hours. Now comes the fun task of sanding, starting with 80 grit to remove any remaining glue and get it nice and flat. Now don't be fooled by this accelerated shot because this is actually the real speed I'm going at, and it took me a good 15 minutes to get through one side. I flipped the top over, a lot lighter now without all the clamps, and sanded it with 80 grit on the other side, hitting the edges too. With the top now flat, I pause the sanding at this point to work on shaping the desk. I finally get to try out my new toy to square off the ends and trim the desk to its final size. Of course, if you don't have a track saw, you can also use a circular saw with a homemade guide rail. That's what I did for years, and it worked just as well. Maybe not as smooth and clean as a cut, but it'll work. Next, I use my trim router with a small roundover bit on all the edges. I'm rounding over the edges ever so slightly, it's barely noticeable really, just enough to knock off the sharpness and break the edges. You could also do this with a block plane or even just sand the edges. Alright, time to get back to sanding, but rather than bore you, I'll just share 2 tips. First, it really helps to make pencil lines before you start on a new grit. This will help you gauge your speed and sand more evenly. And second, did you know there was a simple rule when going up in grits? Never increase by more than 50%. So if you're starting with 80 grit, plus 50% is 120. Plus 50% is 180. And plus 50% is up to 270, but I'll stop at 220. If you skip ahead any faster, you'll likely see swirl marks in your finish. I'm going to finish this top with Osmo Pollux oil, but first I vacuum the entire room to avoid any dust contamination. And I'll use this tack cloth to catch any remaining dust nibs. I've seen different methods to apply Osmo, either with a roller or a pad, but I've also seen people use a plastic spreader and I wanted to give it a try. It took a little getting used to, but ultimately I found it was really easy to spread the finish around in a thin coat, getting good coverage. The important thing is to wipe up any excess with a lint-free cloth, and when I was done, I used another clean Osmo Easy Pad to wipe down the top again. I applied 2 coats to the bottom face, let it dry, then flipped it over to work on the top face. I love using this product because it's so easy to apply and gives such a smooth, silky finish. And it's low VOC, and both coats can be applied within 1 day. Pretty awesome. I let it fully cure for a few days, then came back to slide the desktop into position. Ever since I started planning this build, I've questioned whether or not I would attach the top to the base cabinets. Now that it's built, I'm not sure that's really necessary, but I figure if I don't do it now, I'll never do it. I'm going to screw the desktop down from inside the cabinets up into the desk. But if I just drive in screws without allowing for wood movement, the desktop will likely end up cracking over time. So instead I'm going to make elongated holes at the back so the screws can move with the wood when it expands and contracts. All that's left is to get the top back into position, drive the screws, and this desk will be ready to use. I'm so excited to finally have a big desk with plenty of storage where I can store all of my audio and video gear and work on editing my videos.